Thank you to Kelly Hancock and Bob Sayre of the American Civil War Museum for inviting me here to the Fall Festival here at Appomattox Courthouse. The Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War is the first in the Nameless and Faceless collection. The additional two books are the Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War and the Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War, Gettysburg, Manassas, and more. The first two books earned me Artist in Residence through the National Parks Art Foundation, National Park Service, Gettysburg, Poetry, September 2020, and Artist in Residence through the National Park Service, Manassas, Virginia, for Poetry, October 2021. As a side note, I would like to share with you, I'm very proud that Gettysburg and Manassas received a book nomination from the International Edgar Allan Poe Saturday Visitor Festival and Awards on October 4th and 6th in Baltimore. The nomination was from the category Original Works Inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's Life and Writing. Very proud of that. The books are a collection of 28 poems and 28 historical essays on the Civil War. And the premise of all the books is that we know that not everyone who witnessed and experienced the Civil War made it into the history books. So, what of all the unknowns? By combining the rhyme and narrative of poetry with Civil War history, a lost voice of the past comes forth to share their experiences and their suffering, a place where the humanity of history and the songs of the soul come together to create a deeper empathy for those lost and unknown. The lines of North and South are blurred in these collections. There are no border states, no governance of politics, for it is my belief that suffering has no boundaries. These poems go beyond the military aspect of the Civil War, beyond generals, beyond flanking maneuvers, and even beyond who won and lost. It rests, however, in the souls of those without a name and without a face. The narrator in the poems recounts a historical scene of the Civil War. Represented here are soldiers, civilians, nurses, doctors, all who experienced the vast pain and misery of the war. These poems give those unknowns a place to tell their tales of compassion, life, death, and agony and grief, as a reminder to the world that they did not die in vain. The inspiration for the entire collection comes from a prisoner of war diary of a Union soldier named Michael Dougherty. Michael was born in Ireland and would come to reside in Bristol, Pennsylvania. He would go on to earn the Medal of Honor 1897 for gallantry on October 12, 1863, for his action at Jefferson, Virginia. Michael was in Company B, 13th Volunteer Pennsylvania Cavalry, and was captured on multiple occasions during his time as a soldier, during which he kept a diary. He spent time at Pemberton's, Libby, Belle Island, and eventually to Andersonville Prison in Andersonville, Georgia. It was while he was imprisoned at Andersonville that the horrors of his confinement were brought to light. The deplorable treatment of the Union prisoners in the summer of 1864 was so dreadful, it was actually heartbreaking to read of his treatment and the treatment of all those prisoners. It was extremely difficult to read Michael's diary, especially his writings from Andersonville. But I believe if he was compelled to write about his experience, then I too felt compelled to bring forth his voice and share his suffering. According to the National Park Service, Andersonville National Historic Site began as a stockade built about 18 months before the end of the U.S. Civil War to hold Union Army prisoners captured by the Confederacy. Located deep behind Confederate lines, the 26.5-acre Camp Sumter, named for the South Georgia county it occupied, was designed for a maximum of 10,000 prisoners. At its most crowded, it held more than 32,000 men, many of them wounded and starving in horrific conditions with rampant disease, contaminated water, and only minimal shelter from the blazing sun and the chilling winter rain. In the prison's 14th month of existence, some 45 Union prisoners arrived here. Of those, 12,920 were buried in a cemetery created just outside the prison walls. It was to these conditions that Michael arrived at Andersonville in February 1864. In October 22nd, 1864, he pens a poem of despair. And I'm going to read you a little excerpt. Quote, When our country called for men, we came from forge and shop and mill, from workshops, farms, and factories, our broken ranks to fill. We left our quiet northern homes that once we loved so well, to vanquish all the Union foes or fall where others fell. Now in prison drear we languish, and it is our constant cry, "O ye who yet can save us, will you leave us here to die?" Unquote. After his release from prison camp in April of 1865, he was sent to Camp Fisk, the parole camp set 4 miles from Vicksburg, Mississippi. He was aboard the overcrowded steamship the Sultana, with over 2,000 recently paroled prisoners of war. On April 27, 1865, the Sultana's boilers exploded just south of Memphis, Tennessee, killing over 1,200 former prisoners and civilians. Not only did he survive Andersonville, but the Sultana as well. Unbelievable. An excerpt of Michael's writing during his time at Andersonville stated that, quote, 100 men a day are dying, unquote. And this struck with me, that they were just numbers, men without a name or without a face. It was his words that brought forth the idea of Nameless and Faceless, as I thought of all those who witnessed the Civil War and died and lay buried in the thousands upon thousands of unknown graves that marked their final resting places on our Civil War battlefields. It was then I realized it is never just words on a page. By reading into the words and feeling the emotions contained in those words, I cannot give these unknowns a name or a face, but I can give them a voice to tell their stories of compassion, life, death, and grief as a reminder to the world that they did not die in vain. Also, it is my belief an author writes from the heart. However, a poet writes from the soul. And so we begin. The inspiration for the first poem is from a woman named Cornelia Peake MacDonald. This is from the Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War. Cornelia Peake MacDonald lived in the town of Winchester, Virginia at the time of the Civil War, and she went on to keep a diary of her experiences during the war entitled A Diary with the Reminiscence of the War and Refugee Life in the Shenandoah Valley, 1860 to 1865. Her town of Winchester, Virginia, would change occupation from the Confederate to Union some 72 times. Her husband Angus joined the Confederacy, leaving Cornelia and their 9 children to try to survive in the most difficult of times. Cornelia described the fear and horror as the Union Army occupied her home, moving her and her children to just one room. She writes of the daily struggle for food and the daily struggle to keep her children safe and well. Cornelia and her children would eventually flee their home and become refugees of the war. Her husband Angus became a colonel in the Confederacy and would die on December 1st, 1864. But it was the profound grief of her suffering over the loss of her baby daughter Bess that was so intense when I read it and heartbreaking. It reached beyond the years, as she wrote, quote, "One evening as the sun was going down, I held her in my arms, and as she breathed out her little life, her eyes were fixed in my face, with the shadow of death over them. The children stood around sobbing. The little breast heaved and panted one long sigh, and all was still, her eyes still fixed in my face. Ah, that fearful shadow! How I saw it flit over that lovely countenance, withering all its bloom and leaving its own ashen gray to remain forever." The name of this poem is from an unknown woman called Winchester, Virginia, 1862. I made my way past the front of my door to where the earth was disturbed just days before, and stood and gazed at the small square of earth that housed my baby 2 years after her birth. And as I knelt before the tiny grave, the tears falling that could not save her from the early death, baby girl, come back and take my breath. And as I stared at the flowers that bloom and surround you now in your earthly tomb, I heard a thunderous noise, and I raised my head to see the swarm of soldiers, our Johnny Reb, And wonder of wonder, it was ever so true, our daring leader Stonewall, and knew that soon our Winchester, it was known, would battle the Yankees for our home. It was then I saw the general come near, and saw my face flushed with tear, and stood with me beside my baby's grave, his eyes grieving he could not save, and reached for my hand with effortless grace, saying he too knew of the pain I faced, for he too did lose a son, born stillborn, he said, God's will, you see, was done. I met his eyes so deeply colored blue, and knew of his pain, it was so true, and watched in silence as he reached to embrace the little violets around my baby's place, and told me gently as he turned to leave, God is with her, madam, do not grieve. Cornelia wrote that she did see Confederate General Stonewall Jackson one Sunday deep in prayer at her church. But it is to this unknown grieving poem in this poem that perhaps General Jackson did stop to comfort a woman without a name or a face, but now with a voice to share a moment of grief over the loss of her child, a woman, perhaps a woman just like Cornelia. General Jackson had a presence in Winchester, Virginia from November of 1861 to March 1862. He established his headquarters from this location and familiarized himself with the terrain that would later play a vital role in his famous Shenandoah Valley campaign. And this past spring, my husband and I visited Stonewall's headquarters. It was an amazing venue. And also, just recently, as of yesterday, we were able to locate Cornelia Peake McDonald and her husband Angus at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. I was very excited to visit her site. The unknown woman in this next poem is called My Henry. This from the Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War. She has heard President Lincoln is coming to Gettysburg on November 19, 1863, to dedicate the new National Cemetery for the Union's Civil War dead. The Battle of Gettysburg was just months before, July 1st to 3rd, and this woman's husband, Henry, is one of the thousands who died during the battle. She is still suffering at his loss, yet resolves to come to the cemetery to hear President Lincoln. And what she hears in the 2-minute address is riveting. Quote, like poetry from God, I bowed my head to pray, unquote. She tries to move through the crowd to see him and to tell him of her Henry. But the crowd is too much for her to get through. Then in an instant, President Lincoln raises his head and their eyes meet. In that instant, she foresees his death in his eyes, and he too knows of his fate. It binds them together for this one moment in time. I would like to add just a little bit more about the look in President Lincoln's eyes. It was a description of that look by the great American poet Walt Whitman that inspired this poem. Walt Whitman came to Washington, D.C. during the Civil War. He would spend his time visiting the wounded soldiers in various hospitals and reciting his poetry and writing letters for them. From Walt Whitman, he says, I see very plainly Abraham Lincoln's dark brown face with the deep cut lines and the eyes, and always to me with a deep latent sadness in the expression. We have got so that we've exchanged bows, and very cordial ones. He goes on to say, they, President and Mrs. Lincoln, passed me once very close, and I saw the President in the face fully as they were moving slow, and his look, though abstracted, happened to be directed steadily in my eye. He bowed and smiled, but far beneath his smile I noticed well the expression I have alluded to. None of the artists or pictures have caught the deep, though subtle and indirect expression of this man's face. There is something else there. One of the great portrait painters of 2 or 3 centuries ago is needed. The name of this poem is called My Henry. I walk past the patch of earth that housed my Henry now gone. Silence forever from my sight. God help me, I am so forlorn. Is Gettysburg, I tell you now, whose battle he so valiantly did fight, for our Union he did say, I still love him with all my might. 'Tis November now, 5 months has passed since then, so now our president is here to dedicate our fallen men. And so I heard his words quite beautifully, I do say, like poetry from God above, I bowed my head to pray. It took him just 2 minutes or so, as the words flowed ever so divine, like manna from heaven that touched my soul, I know that they did mine. Yet as much as I tried to be near him, the crowd in between too great, I wanted to tell our president of my Henry's fate. I had to try to reach him, to tell him of my heart. It was the look in his eyes that have haunted me, careworn, that gave me a start. For in those eyes it seemed to me he too knew of his fate, and would come to rest, I am sure, in the glory of heaven's gate. The Gettysburg Address, November 19, 1863. Yet such comfort did this unknown woman take away from the president in his brief speech, just 272 words that would describe his compassion and resolution in faith, the words that defined what was happening to his nation. He would end up sacrificing his own life for the freedom and the liberty of all his people. Quote, "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth." Unquote. I have visited the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg and stood near the spot where President Lincoln delivered his address. It is impossible not to be humbled by the rows and rows of the Union dead, some of which are unknown, of course. It is to imagine back to those dark days of the Civil War, picturing the president and the crowd all around him, and then to a woman, an unknown woman, coming to hear him speak and meet his eyes, and in that moment find solace, and in his immortal words, and hope for the country and his people. There are 979 unknown soldiers in the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg. What must it have been like for the Confederate soldiers on April 9, 1865, as Confederate General Robert E. Lee made his way to the Wilmer McLean House in Appomattox, Virginia? It must have been unforgettable to be there while the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, surrendered to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant and his Union forces. It is to imagine the heavy hearts within the ranks that day for the Confederacy. 4 years of bloodshed and battles did not yield them a victory, but rather a defeat. The soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia stood dirty, disheveled, some were even barefoot, and most were exhausted and ill health for lack of food and shelter. The remnants of the Southern forces would have continued the fight if asked, and would have gone wherever their beloved General Lee commanded, yet there would be no more fighting. This poem is from the Nameless and the Faceless of the Civil War, Gettysburg, Manassas, and more. Lee's General Order Number 9. I heard the officer read aloud, "The General Order Number 9, I avowed. And as I stood beside my brethren, arm in arm till the end, was it truly over as I bowed my head, 4 years of fighting and all who bled? To surrender here at Appomattox we came, to the Union Army I do refrain. I have no shoes, I am threadbare, nothing to eat I do declare. We would follow him to continue to fight, General Lee in all his might. Yet it is done as our officer reads, lay down your weapons and time to leave. And remember those who came before, the Army of Northern Virginia is no more." And with that said, it was time to end, to forge new futures and amend, and unite with our Union counterparts. Our country is one again with a new start. Yet as I hung my head with thought of what was, I saw our General Lee on Traveler, it gave me pause. And I was one of his men that raced to his side. He bade farewell, and with quiet pride, for all we had done in this bloody fight, our brethren in the most egregious plight. General Lee stood firm and straight, as traveler passed by at a gentle gait. We followed him into the springtime glen and dell. I heard him say, I bid you all an affectionate farewell. The next day, April 10th, 1865, General Lee issued what is known as General Order No. 9. It reads as follows, quote, after 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the brave survivors of so many hard-fought battles who have remained steadfast to the last that I have consented to this result from no distrust of them, but feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that could compensate for the loss that must have attended the continuance of the contest, I am determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen. By the terms of the agreement, officers and men can return to their homes and remain there until exchanged. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed, and I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessing and protection. With an unceasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration for myself, I bid you an affectionate farewell. R. E. Lee, General. This next poem is from the Nameless and Faceless Women of the Civil War. It was included in the spring issue of Civil War magazine. I was also quite proud of that. In this poem, we hear the voice of an unknown woman, in this case, a Northern mother, who received a letter from her son Ethan's commanding officer that he was killed during the Battle of Gettysburg. In it, she realizes that after the battle, thousands of soldiers are lying dead in and around the Klingel House, and one of the dead was her son, Ethan. The name of this poem is The Klingel House. My eyes could barely see for the tears that stung my sight of the news my son Ethan had ascended to the Almighty's light. The letter I held in my hand from your commander I see, to tell me of your bravery so that others could be free. In early July of 1863, upon the battlefield of our North, Gettysburg, 'tis the name, so how you did go forth. The 3 days of such fighting, the slaughter I cannot grasp. So many gone like you, my son, I fear I shall collapse. But as I read the letter and heard of how you died, it is as if I can see you, my son, and be there at your side. So now I will take my breath and read the part of your pain, and left this earth a better man, of this I shall refrain. 'Twas on July the 4th, the holiday of our nation's birth, they found your body, my son. With your comrade next to you, God's will you see was done. It says here you were wounded and tried to take shelter, I see, to the Klingel farm under the porch, yet it was not meant to be. The owner came and found his farm littered with the dead of 3 days of the din of battle where the nation bled. I see you, my son, under that porch as you tried to save your life, yet God had other plans for you and took you from that strife. There is no more to say just now. The letter, it ends with thanks for the sacrifice of so many, my Ethan in the ranks. Story of the Klingel House, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Klingel House was purchased by Daniel Klingel in April of 1863. He lived there with his wife Hannah and 2 little children. He was a farmer and a shoemaker. Little did Daniel and his family realize in just 3 months the house would lie amidst the bloodiest days of fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg, July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. On July 2nd, the family was warned by the Union forces to leave their home. They vacated their property as per the warnings and headed by way of the Trossel Farm to the base of Little Round Top. It would be here at the foot of Little Round Top that an assault by the Confederates would commence and invariably fail. Thousands of soldiers, both Union and Confederate, would be the result of this assault. On July 4th, the Klingel family returned to their home to a devastating scene. Bullet holes riddled the house, and powder marks charred the walls from inside the house where the soldiers had taken refuge to continue their fight. Crops were destroyed, as well as a portion of their home and fences and property. Quote, "The farm was covered by the dead. Bodies lay all around the house. 2 were just inside the gate, and 2 others were under the porch, where they must have crawled for shelter before dying of their wounds. One shattered tree in the Klingels' orchard concealed 4 dead soldiers huddled around a cooking pan with foods still in it," unquote. I visited the Klingel house and stood on that very small porch. The Klingel house is one place on the Gettysburg battlefield that calls me time and time again to visit. I'm sure we all have our favorite places when we go to the battlefields, but this particular one in Gettysburg is mine. From there, it's as if the voice of this unknown woman comes to light to tell us of her son, his great sacrifice, and the pride she had in his death. There's a palpable sadness that surrounds this house, silent and quietly heartbreaking, yet brought to life by this unknown mother and son, bound together forever on the fields of a town called Gettysburg. The history of the handkerchief doll. During the Civil War, dolls made from the handkerchiefs of fathers, brothers, or uncles were given to children as the men departed for war. Too often, these dolls were all the children possessed to remind them of the loved ones who sometimes never returned from battle. In this next poem, we hear from an unknown father whose daughter gave him her doll to hold and keep him safe during battle. While this first battle of Bull Run, Manassas, July 21st, 1861, it is to our imagination of a father holding on to his daughter's handkerchief doll as his life ebbs away. The caveat of the story is that while he lay dying on the battlefield, the doll shows no sign of blood. The father in his last moments were of his little daughter and that the doll would be returned to her in the same pristine condition. And although he would die, the doll did protect him, maybe not from the Union bullet, but would aid him in his ascension to God. Now, there may be no documented historical incidents of a father on the battlefield holding on to his little girl's doll as he lay dying. We're reminded that this story is of an unknown soldier, and who's to say it didn't happen? This next poem is from the Nameless and Faceless of the Civil War, Gettysburg, Manassas, and more. This is called The Handkerchief Doll. As I sat here in the late evening night, watching the fading hues of God's delight, the bivouac fires cracked and gleamed as I read your letter like heaven to me. It was July 20, the eve before the battle plan, when first Manassas would take a stand. It said Chantilly on the address, yet the writing was that of a little miss. My heart began to beat. I could not resist. I tore it open and saw stuffed inside a handkerchief doll, my MMA's pride. Dear Papa, I began to read. Mama and I miss you beyond all we can say. Please finish up those Yankees and come home to stay. Mama says it will be a quick fight and you will be home after the strife. She told me the northern states came to invade our land and that you and others had to take a stand to defend what is ours and what will be this little farm with just us 3. Please take the doll you made for me and keep her for all time, for I will be near you always in my heart and in my mind. I will close now, dear Papa, and wait to know that you are coming home and the Yankees no longer our foe. My head bowed down as I tried not to let others see the stain of tears that almost broke me. I held the letter and doll in my hands and folded carefully to my heart, where it would stay to have and to hold, and God willing, never to part. The call to battle that very next day was one I shall never forget. I was with Stonewall and his brigade to present our threat. Then the command yelled like furies, and his legend was born that day. With bayonets gleaming and cannon fire all around, I was caught in the fray. It was while I was fighting in the mist and haze, I heard a whizzing sound that I thought had missed all those around me, including myself. It was then I was remiss. I felt a burning in my lower back and fell hard to the earth below. I sank to the greenest of glen. This I can tell and know. I don't know how long I lay there, for I lost time and space. And then when I finally awoke, I could not move, and I cried, asked for God's grace. The battle was over. I did not know what to do. I heard cries from those all around. I realized so many like me were injured on this ground. Who will come and help us? I prayed to the Almighty in my deepest fear. What seemed like an eternity, a soldier came by and told me help was near. I told him, look beneath me. The green glades of grass was red with life. I had not much time left to me, yet I begged him to listen to my strife. For I knew I had just a moment or two before the angels would come for me and take me to God's arm to ascend to him and help me to be free. Just one more thing, please, I asked the soldier to do. Go into my pocket and find the letter for my darling, the one I love so true. He reached into my pocket with the letter and opened it with care. Like a miracle from heaven, not a stain of blood did appear. The little handkerchief doll was unharmed and looked exactly the same. Beg your pardon. Pristine and loved, just as it came. It was exactly like she had given me to protect me from this fight. I knew I had received a blessing from the Almighty's might. Please go now and tell my MMA that she did protect me on this day. Perhaps not from the bullet that took me, you see, but let me into God's loving arms. Oh, he was waiting for me. The silent witness doll. However, there is an actual historical reference to a child's doll, and the witness to two events, one during the opening battle of the Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas on July 21, 1861, and the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on April 9, 1865, at the Wilma McLean House at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. This doll is in fact a silent witness to history. The doll's owner's name was Lula McLean, the young daughter of Wilma McLean. Wilma McLean was a native of Alexandria, Virginia. In 1853, he married a wealthy widow named Virginia Mason. The couple then moved into a house near Manassas, Virginia. By 1861, the American Civil War had begun. During the First Battle of Manassas, McLean's house served as General Beauregard's headquarters. By the Second Battle, fought a year later, McLean, now a merchant trader speculating in sugar, decided to move his family. Wilma moved to the relative safety of a two-story house on the Lynchburg-Richmond Stage Road. The house, located in the small village of Appomattox Courthouse, was the house that became the meeting place for Generals Lee and Grant on April 9, 1865. Wilma McLean would later state that the Civil War began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. Now, while Lula's silent witness doll, which was in the parlor where the surrender took place, is a historic reminder of the past of this young girl, what about all those unknown little girls and unknown fathers who are lost to our Civil War history? And in the poem, The Handkerchief Doll, this unknown soldier's voice comes forth to share the story of his daughter, Emma May, and her handkerchief doll, an unknown silent witness, as it were, to the love between a dying father for his little girl. I'd just like to stop here for a moment to bring your attention to the many instances in the poem, as you can see, where God is mentioned. I included the outpouring of man to God as to understand the importance of God and faith before and during after the Civil War. In the mid-1800s, in the United States experienced a wave of Christianity, meaning the strong belief in the church and the relationship of God and church with the community. That is why in so many of the poems the outcry is, God help me. Also included in this strong faith was the belief in the good death. They believed to experience a good death would be to prepare for one's death, to die at home with loved ones all around you, to hear your last words, and to be assured that they will all unite in their faith. The Civil War and its sudden and violent deaths made the good death impossible. And in the only way they knew, some Civil War soldiers who lay dying on the battlefield would often try to recreate the good death by surrounding themselves, often by clutching a photo, a letter, or maybe even their child's doll, as the last thought of their loved ones as they passed away. I will now read a poem from my new Nameless and Faceless collection. It is called Under the Dogwood Tree. It tells of two friends, soldiers, who were fighting together during the Battle of Wilderness, Virginia in May of 1864. In this instance in this poem, neither the side of the North or the South is identified. The inspiration for this poem comes from Drew Gilpin Faust's book, The Republic of Suffering, and the documentary Death and the Civil War. For we know there were instances when a soldier would write to a fallen soldier's family and try to describe or identify where they had buried them. Perhaps they tried to carve their name on a rough piece of board, maybe nail it to a tree. But in this instance, place a small map with directions as to how and where to find them. It's actually instances where you would see a small map included in the letter, and they would have, perhaps a church, so many steps to a particular tree, or to a school. It was extraordinary. They tried to include that kind of detail to help their loved ones find their soldier. Under the dogwood tree. I take my pencil to tell you now of how your son died that day. Upon the battlefield of the wilderness, please read on as I say. It was a time of day called twilight. Of this I do believe, that we marched and I saw him fall, so how I do now grieve. I dropped my musket amidst the shot and fire, and knelt beside him. I knew then it was so dire. But I was ordered double quick to my feet and hurried on my way. Yet I knew I would come back to find him somewhere in the fray. Later I asked to search for him in between the lines of dread, but I was denied and had to wait and watched as the rivers ran red. Then next I was ordered into our field where our soldiers lay without breath, as the grim reaper gathered his harvest in anticipation of so much death. And as I began to dig to bury your son, I knew I had to do more. I snipped the locket of his bright blonde hair and sent to you to adore. Also you will find a map of where I laid him to rest. I drew it as best I could to guide you in your quest. And as the pink petals of the dogwood tree rained down upon my face, that I could not leave him there without a name or without a face. I pray then you will find your soldier son, of this I do decree. Look for him there, if you can, under the dogwood tree. Once again, I would just like to conclude with the words of our great American poet Walt Whitman and an excerpt from The Million Dead, 1865. This was also from Death in the Civil War. His poetic works from this time are without question the most heartfelt and heartbreaking. Here he captures the essence of those nameless and faceless of the Civil War. From Walt Whitman, The Million Dead, 1865. The dead, the dead, the dead, our dead, for South or North, ours all, our young men, once so handsome and so joyous, taken from us, the son from the mother, the husband from the wife, the dear friend from the dear friend. And everywhere among these countless graves we see, and ages yet may see, on monuments and gravestones, singly or in masses, the thousands or tens of thousands, the significant word unknown. Perhaps the next time you visit one of our Civil War battlefields and cemeteries, you might pause and linger for just a moment on the gravestone that says unknown, and think of that lost and forgotten soul, and for that instant they are no longer nameless and faceless of the Civil War. Thank you all very much. Oh, thank you.